Hello, I'm Michael Ashby. The title of this paper is The First Spoken Intonation Corpus. It's a reassessment of this work, Intonation Curves, written by Danel Jones and published in 1909. Intonation Curves is an early work by the UCL phonetician Danel Jones. When it was published in 1909, Jones was still in his 20s and right at the beginning of his career at University College London. It's based on the analysis of 8 commercial gramophone records of the day, chosen by Jones to represent 3 languages, English, French and German, and to cover 2 styles, literary and conversational. Aligned with the intonation curves themselves, Jones gives a detailed segmental transcription of the speech on the records, and on the facing page, the orthographic version and another standard transcription, which is his own approximately phonemic transcription of the text rather than the recording. So Jones has a set of recordings, about 20 minutes of speech in total, and he provides time-aligned representations on several levels. So whereas in one way the work is a sort of phonetic reader, a resource for learners of the languages, from another point of view it deserves to be seen as an early example of a speech corpus, perhaps the very first. Jones represents intonation on a musical stave. This wasn't uncommon at the time, not only for intonation and tone, but in acoustic work more widely. After all, the musical notation of pitch is essentially a logarithmic scale of frequency. So when Jones shows a pitch here, for example, he doesn't just mean that it sounds like an F in the bass clef. He means quite specifically that the frequency is what the notation implies, in this case 174.6 Hz. They may look quaint now, but the intonation representations are in principle quantitative. At least they are as far as frequency goes. The time axis is a different matter. Jones divides the intonation curves into bars. Each bar is one phonetic syllable. The width of each one on the page is simply the space taken up by the symbols required to transcribe it. So some end up narrow, some end up wide, and the resulting width has nothing to do with real duration. The method of working was to listen repeatedly to the records, lifting the needle from the record at successive points, and noting, as Jones says, the impression of the sound heard at the instant when the needle is lifted. The method was also used in making the detailed segmental transcriptions. Jones says it's generally necessary to take several observations for the quality of a given sound, and several more for its pitch. He doesn't say, but a rough calculation suggests that you'd have to do this about 75,000 times to work through the material. Looking at the details of the records which Jones specifies, I had an idea. The records are 110 years old. But might it be possible to find copies of some of them, analyze them digitally, and compare the results with those published by Jones? Well, long story. Some of the records were found fairly quickly, others entailed a long search. But so far I have reasonably good digital copies of 6 of the 8. I found that Tolkien's robust algorithm for pitch tracking, RAPT, produces satisfactory pitch tracks even with these noisy old records. So now we can try a comparison. The obvious approach is to select a sample of Jones, quantize his curve by measuring pixel coordinates at selected points in high resolution, place corresponding annotations in the audio, pick out the fundamental frequency values, and make a scatter plot. Here's a result from 25 syllables of French, sampled at 50 points. There's a very good correlation, and the slope is almost exactly 1. The intercept is not going to be exactly at the origin, but if you think about it, it probably wouldn't be. Jones had a clockwork gramophone with variable speed. It's most unlikely that it would have been running at exactly the modern standard of 78 RPM. So Jones is doing very well. But actually, he's doing even better than the scatter plot reveals. Jones's pitch track and the one from the algorithm are almost exactly the same. It's just that they keep getting a bit out of sync, sometimes in one direction, sometimes in the other. A lot of the dispersion in the scatter plot probably results from misalignment of the selected sample points, and that's a consequence of Jones's segmental timescale, which can't be turned back into real time without a certain amount of guesswork. A better approach might be to take the modern analysis but plot it Jones's way, since there is an explicit mapping from real time to Jones time. So, make a system that accepts frequency values in Hertz and displays them on a logarithmic scale, along with constants to plot the lines and graphic elements to complete the stave. Here the system's plotting a test signal going up in semitones. To match the pseudo-time of Jones's bar lengths, we need to annotate the audio files again, but this time to match the phonetic segments transcribed by Jones. A script can then stretch or compress the timescale in each region so as to give the required width when it's plotted. Here's an example, chosen more or less at random, indicating an astonishing level of agreement.
Posting letters, cashing money orders.
Notice the pitch trough in the first syllable of letters, the small peak located in the second syllable of caching, and how the greater part of the final rise is correctly placed in the second, unstressed syllable of orders. Overall, Jones's judged pitch is about 4% flat compared with the modern analysis, suggesting that he was playing this record at approximately 75 RPM. Here's another example.
The grocer's shop nearly opposite.
Again, there's a remarkable degree of agreement between the automatically extracted version and Jones's. The shape and range of the two nuclear tones correspond closely, and Jones has also accurately tracked the rising fundamental frequency pattern on each of the two pre-nuclear accents. Even the pitch of the weak anacrusis the has been heard correctly. Wherever we pick an example, the results are impressive. Jones can deal equally well with a female voice, as here, notice the switch to the treble clef, and he can track tiny variations within syllables when verse is being intoned almost on a monotone, as here.
Keeping time in a sort of runic rhyme.
So, a remarkable achievement, and an interesting old book. But what is the relevance today? So far, I've said little about the process of extracting the fundamental frequency from the old recordings. They aren't ideal signals. It was a noisy process. The records were already noisy when they were new, and more than a century of wear hasn't improved them. And being entirely acoustic, no microphones, no amplifiers, they have a restricted and uneven frequency range. Here's a long-term spectrum from the English conversation recording. The lack of high frequencies is well known and expected. But low frequencies are also missing. The lower harmonics of the voice are greatly attenuated and the fundamental itself essentially missing. With this input, any pitch tracker and the voicing detector it always depends on or incorporates may struggle. I've already mentioned the RAPT algorithm. If I'd tried to use RAPT, the virtually unquestioned choice of many researchers, my results would certainly have been different and probably less satisfactory. Putting the same signal into RAPT produces this. We can adjust various settings, but this is about the best that we can do. There are hundreds of other pitch trackers. Each will give a somewhat different result. And of course it's not difficult to find algorithms that perform significantly worse than RAPT's. So the pitch tracker in RAPT isn't the worst for this application, but it doesn't appear to be the best either. Jones wasn't disturbed by the noise or the uneven frequency response of his recordings. Being a human listener, his pitch tracking abilities were better than any algorithm. The moral, especially for those working with legacy recordings, is that it's wise to evaluate a range of tools and look critically at their performance. And when it comes to choosing among alternative tools, the extent to which their output matches the best human judgment should be a relevant consideration. Jones's work has been described as impressionistic and of dubious empirical status. In fact, as this study shows, Jones's representations are quantitative, precise, objective, and verifiable. It's probably been assumed generally that systems of intonation description were necessarily first advanced on the basis of impressionistic or invented data, and only later tested with empirical data from actual speakers. What this study shows, however, is that accurate intonation data was available for English, French, and German several years before the earliest attempts at formal intonation description in any of the three languages. If you have comments or questions, please do get in touch by email. I'd like to conclude by thanking the chairs and organisers of this conference for responding swiftly and flexibly to the coronavirus pandemic and rearranging the conference so that it was possible for us to hear papers and to present papers, even though our meeting in Tokyo unfortunately had to be cancelled. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.